Elias used to believe that exhaustion was a moral failure. If he woke up tired, it meant he hadn't prayed correctly, hadn't focused long enough, hadn't purified his thoughts before sleep. That belief alone had kept him trapped for years, cycling through techniques, teachers, and books that all promised clarity but somehow left him more drained by morning. The city didn't help. The coastal air was always heavy, the streets always damp, like the place itself was half asleep and pulling everyone else down with it. He worked out of a narrow apartment above an old print shop, walls lined with notebooks instead of furniture. Notes about consciousness, marginalia on banned texts, diagrams of circles inside circles. None of it felt alive anymore. He could explain transcendence better than anyone he knew, yet his own inner life felt flat, muted, like a radio tune just off the station. The rumor reached him through an encrypted forum post with no author name. Just a paragraph. No mysticism. No promises. It mentioned a practice reduced to 2 spoken words, used not to ascend, not to escape, but to recognize. The post claimed it was once common, then deliberately obscured, not because it was powerful in a dramatic sense, but because it removed the need for intermediaries entirely. Elias almost scrolled past it. He had trained himself to distrust simplicity. Every serious system he'd studied required complexity, layers of preparation, hierarchies of insight. 2 words felt like an insult. Still, something about the tone stopped him. There was no persuasion in it, no urgency. Just a quiet assumption that if you were ready, you would already know why it mattered. That night, he didn't prepare. No fasting, no candles, no posture. He waited until his body reached that familiar edge where thoughts loosened and images began to drift without effort. He noticed how instinctively he tried to control the moment, to aim it somewhere higher. The post had warned against that. It said effort was the trap. Direction came later. When the moment arrived, he spoke the words softly, almost embarrassed by how plain they sounded in the dark room. There was no light, no vision, no surge of emotion. At first, nothing happened at all, then the sense of being located behind his eyes loosened. Not vanished, just softened. The room didn't disappear, but it stopped feeling like something he was inside of. It felt more like a pattern he was aware of, the same way he was aware of his own breath. There was no movement, yet the pressure he carried in his chest released, as if a long-held assumption had been quietly corrected. The most unsettling part was how ordinary it felt. Not blissful. Not ecstatic. Familiar, in a way he couldn't place. He had expected leaving, some kind of exit, ascent, or shift. Instead, it felt like remembering he had never actually arrived anywhere in the first place. Sleep came after, but it was different. Not the blackout he was used to, but a soft descent, like laying down something heavy without ceremony. When he woke before dawn, the usual dull ache behind his thoughts was gone. Not replaced by energy, just absence. As if noise he'd assumed was permanent had been switched off. Elias spent the morning trying to analyze it, and immediately felt the old reflex return. Explanations, comparisons, categories. The more he reached for language, the further the experience receded. That, too, had been mentioned in the post. The practice wasn't something you held. It was something you stopped blocking. That he searched for the source of the text. It wasn't tied to any school he recognized. The phrases were wrong for mainstream mysticism, too precise for poetry, too restrained for doctrine. Eventually, he found fragments, references scattered across marginal notes, dismissed translations, footnotes labeled speculative. Different eras, different regions, same idea repeated with slight variations. Recognition precedes movement. Awareness before direction. what struck him most was what had been removed. No instructions on morality. No commandments. No warnings about worthiness. Just a single condition repeated again and again: you must be willing to experience without interpretation. Apparently, that requirement alone had disqualified most people. By the third night, fear crept in. Not of the experience itself, but of what it implied. If access was this direct, then years of striving had been unnecessary. Not wrong, just beside the point. The implication wasn't that teachers had lied, but that they had built elaborate maps around something that could only be recognized, never reached. When Elias spoke the words again, the shift came faster. This time, there was a clear sense of standing at a threshold that had always been open. No guards. No gate. Just the realization that he had been facing the wrong direction. That he understood then why the practice had been reduced to rumor. It didn't create followers. It didn't scale. It made authority irrelevant, including his own. And as the quiet expanded, not outward, but inward, he felt something close to grief. Not for what he'd lost, but for how long he'd believed he needed permission to return to what was already present. The days that followed unsettled Elias more than the first night ever had. Nothing mystical lingered on the surface. He still washed dishes, answered messages, walked the narrow streets near the harbor. Yet beneath those ordinary motions, something had quietly reorganized itself. He noticed how often his attention tried to leap forward, as if meaning lived just ahead of the present moment. Each time it did, there was a subtle tightening, a faint echo of the exhaustion he knew too well. The practice hadn't removed his habits. It had revealed them. He returned to the fragments he'd collected, reading them with slower eyes now. What once looked like obscure metaphysics suddenly read like technical notes, warnings, really. Over and over, the same mistake was named in different language, confusing recognition with reaching. Treating awareness like a destination instead of a condition. Trying to move toward what was already the case. One passage described seekers who spent decades refining themselves, only to feel permanently separated from the source they spoke about daily. Not because they were impure, but because they had turned unity into an object. Something to acquire. Something granted later. Elias recognized himself immediately and felt a mix of relief and embarrassment at how predictable his struggle had been. He traced the fragments back through translations and marginalia until a pattern emerged. This wasn't a lost religion. It was a method that refused to become one. Whenever it appeared too clearly, it dissolved the structures built around it. Teachers lost students. Rituals lost urgency. Institutions lost leverage. The response had always been the same: absorb the language, discard the function. Elias tested this understanding in his own body. During the day, he practiced noticing without correcting. Sounds, sensations, thoughts, none elevated, none rejected. At first, it felt passive, almost negligent. He was used to effort signaling seriousness. Without it, doubt crept in. Was he becoming complacent? Detached? Avoidant? Then he noticed something else. When awareness wasn't aimed at improvement, it became intimate. He could feel irritation arise without narrating it. Fatigue could pass through without turning into a story about failure. Even moments of clarity came and went without demanding interpretation. The inner commentary that once felt essential now sounded optional. On the fourth night, the words failed him. He spoke them, but the shift didn't arrive. Instead, there was tension, subtle, but unmistakable. He realized he was waiting for a result, measuring the moment against previous nights. The practice had turned into a test, and he had unknowingly stepped back into the old posture of seeking that he stopped. Not out of discipline, but because forcing recognition made no sense. If awareness was already present, then striving for it was redundant. He lay there, letting the discomfort exist without explanation. Slowly, the pressure eased. Not into the familiar openness, but into something quieter, acceptance of not knowing. That night, there was no crossing, no threshold. And somehow, that felt right. The following week brought resistance from outside. A colleague he trusted dismissed the practice as spiritual minimalism, accusing it of bypassing ethical development. Another warned him that direct methods often led to dissociation or ego inflation. Elias listened carefully, noticing how easily he could have echoed those concerns himself just weeks earlier. The criticism didn't threaten him because he could feel the difference now. Dissociation felt empty, brittle. What he was experiencing felt grounded, almost heavier than before. More contact, not less. As for ego, the practice didn't elevate him. It removed his usual reference points. Without the identity of advanced seeker, there was very little to defend. One evening, while walking along the breakwater, the realization landed without drama. The source he had chased for years wasn't hidden. It had been framed incorrectly. Not above, not beyond, not elsewhere. It wasn't something consciousness visited. It was what consciousness was, before it learned to aim itself. That insight didn't arrive as a thought. It arrived as a release of tension he hadn't known he was carrying. The sense of being a center looking outward softened again, replaced by a field of simple presence. The sea, the wind, the weight of his body, all of it appeared without hierarchy. Nothing sacred. Nothing profane. Just immediate. Elias understood then why the lineage had never survived intact. You couldn't build authority on something that returned responsibility so completely to the individual. There were no excuses here. No one to blame. No one to credit. Recognition didn't make life easier. It made it unavoidable. That night, when he spoke the words again, he did so without expectation. They didn't open anything. They reminded him to stop closing what was already open. And in that subtle difference, the practice finally made sense, not as a path forward, but as a correction of orientation, repeated as often as forgetting required. By the time Elias committed to the practice fully, it had stopped feeling new. That, more than anything, confirmed its legitimacy. Novelty had always been the hook, visions, insights, dramatic shifts that demanded attention. This was different. Recognition didn't announce itself. It blended into the rhythm of ordinary perception, altering nothing on the surface while quietly changing the terms underneath. The cost appeared slowly. Friends noticed he no longer spoke with the same urgency. He didn't argue metaphysics late into the night or chase abstract conclusions. When asked what he believed now, his answers disappointed people. They wanted positions, frameworks, something they could agree with or resist. What he offered instead felt evasive, even irresponsible. "I'm paying attention," he would say, and leave it at that. Inside, fear surfaced in subtler forms. Without striving, how would he know he was progressing? Without friction, how would growth occur? Entire motivational structures collapsed once he saw how deeply they relied on dissatisfaction. Improvement had been fueled by the assumption that something essential was missing. Letting go of that assumption felt like stepping off a familiar cliff, even if the ground had always been there. One night, the words stopped feeling like a practice at all. He spoke them, and there was no shift, no movement of attention. Just presence continuing as it already was. The absence of effect startled him more than the first experience ever had. It meant the words were no longer doing anything. At first, he panicked. Had he lost access? Had complacency dulled his sensitivity? Then it became clear, the words had never caused recognition. They had only interrupted forgetting. Once forgetting loosened its grip, the interruption was unnecessary. That realization came with responsibility he hadn't anticipated. There was no longer a method to hide behind. No ritual to blame if he felt disconnected. When frustration arose, it was simply frustration, no spiritual meaning attached. When clarity appeared, it didn't make him special. It just made him present. Social pressure increased. He was advised, gently at first, to formalize what he'd found. Write it down. Teach it. Create a structure so others wouldn't misunderstand. Elias understood the impulse. Structures feel safer than openness. They give people something to hold, but he also saw the trap clearly now. The moment recognition became something transmitted, it would turn into a concept again. Something people aimed at instead of noticed. Something delayed, promised, withheld. So he refused. The refusal cost him invitations, credibility, even income. Yet beneath the anxiety that followed, there was a steadiness he had never known. Life didn't feel solved. It felt honest. Pain still occurred. Doubt still visited. But neither required interpretation. They passed through awareness the same way sound or weather did. One afternoon, sitting alone in the apartment, Elias noticed the old urge to check himself. Am I aligned? Am I present? Am I doing this right? The question arose automatically, then dissolved without answer. Not because it was wrong, but because it was unnecessary. Presence didn't need confirmation. The final understanding came quietly. Sovereignty wasn't power. It was accountability without drama. To recognize awareness directly meant there was no one else responsible for seeing clearly. No system to rely on. No future state to reach. Just this, unfolding as it always had. He hadn't left the body. He hadn't escaped the world. He had stopped standing apart from experience, waiting for permission to re-enter it. The practice had returned him to a simplicity so obvious it could only be overlooked. That night, he slept deeply. Not because he was protected, enlightened, or resolved, but because there was nothing left to maintain. Awareness didn't require effort. Only honesty, and that, he realized, was the true cost. Not discipline. Not devotion. But the willingness to live without the story that something essential was elsewhere. If you've stayed with this story to the end, take a moment before moving on. Not to analyze what you heard, not to decide whether you agree, but simply to notice how you're here right now. No technique. No conclusion. Just awareness doing what it already does. Stories like this aren't meant to convince you of anything. They're meant to disturb a familiar orientation, to gently question the habit of always reaching forward for what might already be present. Whether Elias' experience resonates or irritates you doesn't really matter. Both reactions are signs of attention waking up. If this kind of content helps you slow down rather than speed up, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing so you don't miss future explorations that value clarity over spectacle. If something here challenged a long-held assumption, a simple like helps this video find others who may be quietly questioning the same things. And if you know someone who feels exhausted by endless seeking, sharing this might offer them a different angle, one without promises, but with room to breathe. Thanks for listening, for your time, and for your attention.